Okay, this is video lecture number 44. Today we are talking about the end of the second party system. For our subsections today, we have the resistance to the Fugitive Slave Act, the political system in decline, the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the rise of new parties, and finally, Buchanan's failed presidency. So while many Americans celebrated the Compromise of 1850 as a final settlement of all outstanding sectional issues, its central provisions served only to keep those issues visible. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, in response to a common problem among the slave states, made it federal policy not simply to allow slavery in the states where it existed, but to extend the reach of the institution into the heart of the North itself. Anti-slavery militants increasingly turned to direct action, both to free slaves and to protect fugitives from slave catchers and federal marshals. Northerners saw the Fugitive Slave Act as demonstrating the lengths to which the slave power would go in attacking the liberties of even of Americans in the free states. White Southerners saw Northern resistance as evidence that free state residents refused to accept their constitutional obligations. Meanwhile, in 1854, the issue of whether to allow the expansion of slavery in the Western territories reasserted itself with the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which repealed the Missouri Compromise and allowed settlers in the newly organized territories of Kansas and Nebraska to determine the future of slavery there. Alarmed at what they viewed as a fresh triumph of the slave power, a resurgent anti-slavery movement launched a new political party called the Republican Party, of unprecedentedly broad appeal. As Kansas degenerated into civil war between pro-slavery and anti-slavery factions, atrocity stories provided grist for sectional propagandists on both sides, while violence spread to the floor of the U.S. Senate itself. The Supreme Court finally sought to resolve the issue in its 1857 Dred Scott decision. However, its declaration that Congress had no constitutional right to bar slavery from the territories outraged Republicans and raised Northern fears that the court would ultimately declare slavery a national institution. To many Northerners, it was becoming increasingly evident that the federal government had to be purged of all slave power influences, and the vehicle for doing so would be the new Republican Party. All right, so this is the end of the second party system, 1850 to 1858, and we are first looking at resistance to the Fugitive Slave Act. Under the terms of the Fugitive Slave Act, federal magistrates in the northern states determined the status of alleged runaway slaves. The law denied accused blacks a jury trial and even the right to testify, and it allowed the re-enslavement of about 200 fugitives, as well as some free northern blacks. The plight of runaway slaves and the appearance of slave catchers aroused popular hostility in the North and Midwest, and free blacks and abolitionists defied the new law. Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, 1852, which evoked sympathy for slaves and outrage against slavery throughout the North, increased Northern opposition to the act. Northern legislatures enacted personal liberty laws, and in Abelman versus Booth in 1857, the Wisconsin Supreme Court said the act violated the Constitution. The U.S. Supreme Court in 1859 upheld the constitutionality of the Fugitive Slave Act, but by then the act had become a dead letter. Okay, our next section is the political system in decline. The conflict over slavery split both major political parties along sectional lines and stymied creative political leadership. The Whig Party chose General Winfield Scott, but many Southern Whigs refused to support Scott because Northern Whigs refused to support slavery. Democrats were divided at their convention, and no candidate could secure the necessary two-thirds majority. So they settled on a compromise nominee named Franklin Pierce. The Democrats swept the election, and their party was reunited. Conversely, the Whig Party split into sectional wings, and it would never again wage a national campaign. Pierce pursued an expansionist foreign policy to assist northern merchants. He secured railroad rights in northern Mexico with the Gadsden Purchase and tried to seize Cuba, issuing the Ostend Manifesto of 1854. Opposition to the manifesto forced Pierce to halt efforts to take Cuba, but it revived the northern fears of, again, a slave power conspiracy. All right, on to our next section, the Kansas-Nebraska Act. This act, constructed by Democrat Stephen Douglas, divided the northern Louisiana Purchase territory into two territories, Kansas and Nebraska. And it voided the Missouri Compromise line by opening the area to slavery through the principle of popular sovereignty. So the people living there got to choose. The Kansas-Nebraska Act barely passed in 1854 through the use of patronage and persuasion by President Pierce, and proved to be the end of the second-party system. Anti-slavery Northern Whigs and anti-Nebraska Democrats formed a new party, the Republicans. The party stood for opposition to slavery and a celebration of the moral virtues of a society based on the middling class. The American, or Know Nothing Party, had its origins in the anti-immigrant and anti-Catholic organizations of the 1840s. It hoped to unite native-born Protestants against the alien menace of Irish and German Catholics, prohibit further immigration, and also to institute literacy tests for voting. In 1855, the Pierce administration recognized the territorial legislature in Lecompton, Kansas, which had adopted pro-slavery legislation. Free Soilers rejected the legitimacy of the territorial government. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery sides then turned to violence, including the Potawatomi Massacre led by John Brown. All right, our next section is Buchanan's failed presidency. The Republican Party counted on anger over bleeding Kansas to boost its fortunes and nominated James C. Fremont, a Free Soiler, as its presidential candidate. The American Party split into sectional factions. The northern faction endorsed Fremont, and the southern faction nominated Millard Fillmore. The Democrats reaffirmed their support for popular sovereignty and the Kansas-Nebraska Act and nominated James Buchanan. Now, James Buchanan was victorious, and the Republicans eventually replaced the Whigs as the second major party. Republicans had no support in the South, however. If they were to win the next presidential election, it might prompt the southern states to withdraw from the Union completely. Now, President Buchanan was left to devise a way of protecting free soil in the West and slavery in the South. In Dred Scott versus Sanford, 1856, the U.S. Supreme Court opined that a slave's residence in a free state did not make him a free man, and that African Americans were not citizens and could not sue in a federal court. Chief Justice Taney declared that the provisions of the Northwest Ordinance and the Missouri Compromise, which prohibited slavery, had never been constitutional, and that Congress could not give to territorial governments any powers that Congress itself did not possess. Now, this is a big deal. Taney thereby endorsed Calhoun's interpretation of popular sovereignty. Only when settlers wrote a constitution and requested statehood could they prohibit slavery. The Democrat-dominated Supreme Court had declared the Republicans' anti-slavery platform to be completely unconstitutional. Republicans countered by accusing the Supreme Court and President Buchanan of participating in the slave power conspiracy. In 1858, Buchanan recommended the admission of Kansas as a slave state by pursuing a pro-slavery agenda, first with Dred Scott and then in Kansas. He had helped to split his party and the nation. All right, so this is the end of today's video lecture. Please answer the review questions and continue on with your reading.